Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first event of the St Albans Greener Together, a practical guide to low carbon construction. I will introduce the project, and I'll introduce myself first. I'm Luigi Pintacuda. I'm Head of Architecture and Design at the University of Hertfordshire. In this project, the university is partnered with the St Albans City and District Council, and the project has been funded by Innovate UK. It's a 2 years long project, and we are towards the end of this project. The project was designed with the goal to achieve net zero by 2030 all across the St Albans district, and leading this way with more than 100 actions. The idea is to empower people and groups to make difference through innovative and behavioral change campaign. The idea is to enhance the understanding on the invisible impact of everyday choices and the combined benefit of everyone making small changes to reduce energy and transport emission. Now, to move on, I would like to introduce Nicola from St Albans City and District Council to present from the City Council the initiative. Please, Nicola, the stage is yours.
Okay. I'm Nicola Ward, so I'm the project officer for St Albans Greener Together, which is a community-driven project, but I work for the council, so the council is sort of leading it and supporting it. Greener Together is a network of inspired individuals and organisations working together to ensure a more sustainable and healthy future for our district. The network aims to encourage and facilitate sustainable activities across the district by inspiring ideas and providing expert advice, support and funding to bring forward sustainable action. So we've been running the project since, well, the network has really started in last summer. At the moment, one of our more recent activities is to start up a campaign called One Action Together. And the idea of this campaign is to highlight that if everyone takes a small action, we can have a big impact. And this is a campaign that we're encouraging everyone to get involved in, and we're hoping that organisations will also promote it themselves. It's based very much around social media, and we've created some calculations to sort of highlight the impact on as to what happens if one individual is taking an action, what that contributes to. So I would urge you all to get involved and have a look at our website and have a look at how you can get involved with this campaign. One of the other new things that we're doing is we're going to run the week. Now the week is it's a session where you watch 3 films in the space of a week, and there is a facilitator talking with the participants about the films. And then after the 3-week period, you have a sort of follow-up session. So the idea is that you learn a lot more about what's happening in the planet, about climate change, and it then gives you an opportunity to reflect on what actions you might take in your own life. So this is an opportunity that's there for everyone. If you'd like to get involved, it's going to happen on the 17th, 18th and 19th of March. So there are various things that we're doing. I've sort of mentioned a couple of them. It would be great if you'd like to become a member of St Albans Greener Together. So do have a look at our website and get involved and become a member.
Thank you, Nicola. Now to Dipti Ravi, who coordinates with me the organization of this course. Dipti, stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Welcome to the course for the practical guidelines for construction of a low carbon design. And we're having this course as a part of a big picture that we want to deliver for practical solutions. And the first one, starting off with Laura, is about retrofit buildings and focusing on an operational carbon perspective. Going further, we'd have a perspective on embodied carbon and the whole life cycle of a building, and also concentrating on natural building materials. We also have an operational focus for new buildings in the fourth session, and then going on to circular economy and regenerative design as a holistic part of the entire course. So by the end of it, with all the industry experts who we have on board, you should be able to grasp the idea of how you can deliver this on a practical level. And that's our intention, and we hope we're able to deliver it. And starting off with Laura this session, she'd be talking about the retrofit in buildings. She is one of the she's the head of sustainability at Purcell, which is a world's leading heritage architecture firm. She's a part of the Architects Declare steering group, and she's also been a part of ACAN, LETI, and NLA. She's also authored the Heritage Buildings Retrofit Toolkit in partnership with City of London Corporation. And she has a lot of expertise on this topic, and she will be delivering this session for the next hour. And then you have an opportunity for questions, and feel free to raise your hands or send your questions in the chat. To start off, I'd like to ask all of you to take your phones out and scan this QR code to answer the few questions coming up in the next few slides, so that we know where you are and what you feel like you'd want to take away from this session. So to start off, what brought you to this course? What particularly interests you to achieving net zero in retrofit buildings? So the poll is now active. So if you can scan the QR code on the screen, and you will be able to put in your answers, and it'll come up on the screen live. So please go ahead. Oh, wow. That's a whole set of answers. Promoting circular economy, carbon, my passion, and it's my area of expertise because I care about the world we're living in. That's great. Best start with the existing building stock. Gonna leave it on for another minute, and then we can get on to the next question. Future of net zero in retrofit building is becoming popular. The challenge, clients, internal insulation, heritage sites, load reduction, bills. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. The poll will be open for answering later on as well. In the meanwhile, next question. We just want to know more about you. So the poll will now change on your screens. And if you can answer this, how well do you understand the implications of achieving net zero in existing buildings? Okay, that's an interesting
Range.
batch of answers. That's great. Okay, with this in mind, I'll hand it over to Laura to begin the presentation and the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepthi. I am going to share my screen. And is that sharing? Cool. I have lost access to the chat now, so if there is things that pop up in the chat, then if Luigi or Deepthi, if you could kind of just jump in, that would be great. But Deepthi did such a good job of introducing me, so I'm skipped that slide. But for those of you that don't know about Purcell, which is where I'm head of sustainability, Purcell are the world's largest heritage architecture firm, and we specialise in the restoration, the conservation and adaptive reuse of the historic built environment. And we have about 350 people at the moment, including architects, master planners, heritage consultants and building surveyors, working across a range of different sectors and regions, both in the UK and in Asia Pacific. And we've had the privilege of working on and caring for some of the most recognisable buildings in the world. So this evening, we're going to be talking about operational net zero in existing buildings. So as Deepthi said, this is the first of a series of 6 free online discussions covering a range of different topics. And so there may be some crossover with the content of this, with some of the other sessions, but I don't think that that's a problem. It's good to reiterate the important facts. And I would still encourage you to sign up for as many as you can, because they're free and because there's some really fascinating speakers and hopefully some good insights into the world of low carbon construction. So I've split the session into three parts. And first of all, we're going to start off, just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, I'm going to start by covering what we mean by net zero. I know many on the call will probably already be aware of this as much as I am, so hopefully we can kind of skip through that, but it's always good to make sure that we're all on the same page. Then we're going to be taking a look at why retrofit and building reuse is essential to achieving net zero, before we finish up with some guidance and case studies on what good retrofit looks like. I have about 45 minutes of slides, but we have plenty of time. So if you have questions as I'm going along, drop them in the chat. I've got some slides that will allow for a bit of pause and reflection. So do kind of, do try and keep things lively. So what do we mean by net zero? Is it just about putting solar panels on the roof? If only it was that simple. No. So according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, net zero is achieved when greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are equal to those removed from the atmosphere within a certain time period. Greenhouse gases are atmospheric gases that contribute to the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide is the most abundant of those greenhouse gases, which is why we often generically refer to carbon emissions. The more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the more heat is trapped, causing the Earth's temperature to rise and leading to climate breakdown. So really, really simply, if you think of the atmosphere as a giant bath, right now, water is sloshing all over the place because the water pressure is far too high and something's blocking the drain. And if we don't do something, the whole bathroom will be underwater quite soon. So we need to get the atmosphere back in balance and urgently turn down the human carbon emissions tap, and both safeguard and enhance the natural cycles that lead to carbon removal, like halting deforestation, improving soil health, and looking at other techniques like biomass sequestration, storage, and ocean-based approaches like kelp farming and things. Avoiding emissions now will almost always be easier and cheaper than sucking out carbon from the atmosphere later in this century. So 2050 is the internationally agreed target for achieving net zero. To have any chance of keeping global temperatures within a safe and just level for humanity. And that temperature is agreed at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in the Paris Climate Agreement. But we can already see that we just don't really have enough time to waste. We don't have any time to waste, sorry. 2024 was the hottest year ever recorded, and the records haven't stopped so far this year. January reached global average temperatures of 1.75 degrees above pre-industrial level, and was the 18th month in the last 19 months for which the global average surface air temperature was more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the damage that's having around the world to communities is unimaginable, and I'm not going to dwell necessarily on that, because I think we're all here hopefully to focus on solutions this evening. There is one number that I do want you to remember though, and that's 4,434, because that is estimated the number of tons of carbon dioxide that, if emitted today, cause one excess death between now and the end of the century. So to put that into context, the whole life carbon emissions of a typical new build residential development is about 3,000 tons of carbon. So there's a lot to do. So I noticed that there's lots of different people from different backgrounds and professions, and but I imagine that you've all got an interest in the built environment. Regardless of that, regardless of your motivation for being here, regardless of your background, you will likely spend around 80% of your time indoors. We all have an active stake in the built environment. We inhabit buildings the majority of the time. When we travel, we're probably traveling between one building and another building. We sleep in buildings, we work in buildings, we socialize in buildings, we imagine in buildings, we create in buildings. So buildings and the infrastructure that connects them account for 42% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and 27.3% of that is how we heat, power, and operate the buildings that already exist. 77.7% is the materials we use to construct new ones, and that's embodied carbon, which most of you are probably already aware of. Because buildings are such a huge part of the problem, it also means that they can be a huge part of the solution. So reducing operational emissions and rethinking the way we use materials is the only way we're going to get anywhere close to net zero in the coming decades. So understanding the impacts our buildings are having is essential. And so I know there is a session on whole life carbon, but I'm going to just skim through where greenhouse gas emissions relating to buildings can come from. And they can come from a number of different sources at a number of different stages in a building's life. So looking just sequentially from the raw material extraction and supply, transport of those materials to a manufacturing plant, and the manufacturing and fabrication processes that create new materials and products, the transportation of those products to a project site and the emissions relating to that transportation, as well as the construction and installation process. And then obviously once a building is complete, the in-use emissions for embodied carbon, that means the maintenance, repair, replacement and refurbishment of a building. Operationally, it is how we heat, power and supply our buildings. Then there's the emissions associated with the demolition and deconstruction of a building when it comes to the end of its life, the transportation of those waste materials, and the emissions associated with the waste and disposal process. But then there might be future opportunities and benefits of reuse, and the more existing materials we reuse, the lower the emissions associated with new material extraction. And so it's really important to consider all of these processes, regardless of the project, whether it's a new build or a retrofit, because only by accounting for the emissions throughout the whole life of a building can you understand how you achieve a net zero building. And so some of you may be aware of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. Some of you may have contributed to it. The pilot version was launched this year. It is the first attempt to robustly define what net zero carbon means for buildings in the UK. So the standard provides a set of consistent rules to create a level playing field around the claims of net zero. It sets performance targets for both new builds and existing buildings, which are aligned with the science-based trajectories needed to achieve net zero by 2050. And that assumes a 78% reduction in emissions by 2035 for the UK. So the standard is for anyone who wants to fund, procure, design or specify a net zero carbon building, and for anyone who wishes to definitively demonstrate that their building is net zero carbon aligned. It has been developed and agreed through collaboration between built environment organisations and industry leaders, architects, engineers, carbon assessors, developers, with input from over 350 experts from across the industry. And it's quite an amazing milestone. It's quite an amazing feat of collaboration and really worth finding out more information if it's an area that you're working in. I was not one of those 350 experts, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this, and I'm not going to go into more detail than that. But the pilot version is being tested this year with the launch of version 1 planned for next year. And from my point of view, what it really means is makes it hopefully and thankfully makes it harder to greenwash buildings by claiming net zero when they aren't. So that was a whistle-stop tour of a lot of information that hopefully you're already kind of aware of. So and I can't see the chat, but if there's any questions so far on any of that, it might be a bit too early to dive into any. As I say, I can't see the chat. So Luigi, just shout out if there are any.
There are no questions for now. You can.
Okay, cool. I will keep going. So the next bit, I'm just going to talk about why is retrofit essential to net zero, and it might already be very obvious to a lot of you. This is quite a familiar statistic to lots of people. So 80% of buildings which will be occupied by 2050, and remember that 2050 is when we're supposed to have achieved net zero, they already exist today. So decarbonising these existing buildings is a major priority, whether we like it or not. But on top of that, the amount of anthropogenic mass, so that's the materials embedded within inanimate, solid, human-made objects, things like concrete and bricks and metals, that mass exceeded the weight of all global living biomass. So that's plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, and that happened in 2020, and we haven't reversed that quite terrifying milestone. So it's really clear to me that we need to agree that we have enough stuff. We need to nurture our natural resources rather than destroying them. And we need to stop extracting 100 billion tons of raw materials out of the fabric of the planet each year, which 50% of which, by the way, is used in construction. We instead need to look to this existing anthropogenic mass as our resource instead of continuing the destructive take, make and throw away cycles. And that means using the buildings we already have. And I know Duncan Baker-Brown will cover the circular economy in much greater and more expert detail. But the construction industry generates 62% of UK's waste and 32% of all waste that is sent to landfill in the UK. And again, the solution to this is we need to make use of the buildings and materials we already have and stop sending them to landfill. Even the most low carbon home built today is still 15 times the carbon emissions every new home will need to be in 2030 if we are to meet the 1.5 degree target that is agreed. At the current pace, we have 5 more years of carbon budget for building new homes at their average current embodied carbon. This is from a really interesting study that's worth having a look at by Civic Square and Dark Matter Labs called the 3 Degree Neighbourhood. And again, the solution to this, reuse the buildings and materials we already have. And I reflect often on these words of the French architects Lacaton and Vassal. So never demolish, never subtract, remove or replace, always add, transform and utilise with and for the inhabitants. And I think there you can find some really imaginative and inspiring architectural solutions when you take that approach. But our existing buildings are far from perfect. They are still responsible for 27.3% of global emissions through their heating, cooling and powering. And here in the UK, domestic gas boilers in homes produce twice as many greenhouse gases as all the gas-fired powered stations combined. So again, it's not a small challenge that we're facing. It costs the NHS £1.4 billion a year to treat people impacted by poor quality housing. And when you add on the full cost for society, like the cost of care, the cost, loss of productivity and time off work and things, poor housing costs the UK £18.5 billion a year. There's 2.6 million homes in England, which is 11% of the country's housing stock, which are categorised as hazardous to occupants. And the costliest issue for the NHS is poor quality housing that leads to excess cold and damp, usually caused by poor maintenance, lack of insulation and lack of ventilation. In 2022, instability in energy markets, coupled with some of the most energy inefficient housing in Europe, led to 13.4% of households in England living in fuel poverty. So that's when a household needs to spend at least 10% of its income on maintaining a satisfactory heating regime. And it's obviously not just about being cold, as we saw earlier on in the presentation. 2024 was the hottest year on record and likely the warmest in at least the last 125,000 years, even though it didn't necessarily feel like that in the UK. It's now more than likely that those born today will experience a planet that exceeds more than 3 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, and anything above 1.5 we will see from where we stand today, to be honest. Flooding will happen more often and cause a greater degree of damage to our homes and communities. Storms will be stronger and more frequent, damaging power lines, homes and transport links. Summers will be hotter and likely dangerous, and the loss of predictable seasons will lead to food insecurity and global instability. So retrofit must be about carbon emissions and net zero, definitely, but it must also be about resource use, about health and well-being, equity and energy security. And we need to be aware of and prepare for the worst future climate, but also build towards a more resilient and hopeful future. And that is possible. If done properly, retrofit can solve a lot of these problems. I'll list off some of them. So lower energy bills if the building is substantially more energy efficient, increased asset value as buildings are energy efficient, comfortable and durable, improved energy security, reducing energy consumption and integrating renewables, reduced risk of stranded assets by ensuring they remain relevant and usable, reduced rent arrears and void periods, because tenants potentially have lower bills because their energy bills are reduced. Reduced maintenance costs, particularly where old systems can be upgraded. Reduced carbon offset removal costs for the long term, build greater resilience against the impact of changing climatic conditions, delivering on green commitments for businesses and other net zero pledges, attracting climate conscious workforce and clientele, providing healthier, more comfortable buildings, and improving productivity and well-being. And then at a societal level, of course, we've got lower healthcare costs with occupants living in and working in healthier buildings, lower infrastructure costs with energy demand and peak loads reduced, job creation and skills development, because retrofit is a more labour intensive activity than new build, and ensuring the long-term security and relevance of our existing buildings, and in particular our built heritage. So if it's so great, what's stopping us? The scale of the challenge is quite enormous. 14.3 million households require retrofitting in the UK to reach EPC C for all domestic properties by 2035. And according to the National Retrofit Hub, to deliver retrofit proportionally across 10 years in England, the current rate of 250,000 homes per year must rise to 1.5 million per year by 2035, totaling 11.8 million retrofits. So there's a lot to do, and retrofit doesn't always go to plan. A very recent audit of homes that have had external wall insulation since 2022 found widespread cases of poor quality installations that did not meet the required standards, with serious and systemic problems found in homes insulated under government schemes, ECO4 and the Great British Insulation Scheme since 2022. So what does good retrofit look like? I'm going to ask again, just in case there's any particular questions relating to that before we dive into what good looks like.
No question yet.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just keep going. So yeah, what does good look like? First of all, I've been bandying around the word retrofit all evening without properly defining it. And the dictionary definition of retrofit is simply the addition of something, a component or accessory to something that did not have it when manufactured. And so in that sense, we've been retrofitting our buildings for as long as we've had buildings. But within the context that we use it today, that I'm using it this evening, I like the Letty definition of retrofit, which is the upgrading of a building to enable it to respond to the imperative of climate change, because that definition captures both the mitigation measures needed to reduce carbon emissions, but also the adaptation measures needed to prepare our buildings for a changing climate, both of which I believe are of equal importance. So thankfully, there are tons of guidance documents on what good retrofit looks like. It is not a new concept, and especially recently, organisations have been ramping up their efforts to try and encourage the retrofit of all types of buildings, but particularly residential. We are going to drop the links of all of these into the chat towards the end, and I've got a slide at the end that's got all the direct links, so we can share those, but they are freely available on the internet and all very useful and relevant. There's two documents from the BSI setting standards for retrofitting dwellings and non-domestic dwellings, which you may or may not have heard about. So there's PAS 2035, which specifically talks about the retrofitting of dwellings, and then PAS 2038, which is about the retrofitting of non-domestic buildings. Both promote and define a technically robust and responsible whole building retrofit process, which my later slides, when I talk about process, they're kind of based on the principles that are set out in these two documents. They are meaty, wordy documents, but if you are working on a project that requires compliance with either of these, I very much recommend you get a hold of a copy and try and understand what the different roles are, because both of them have slightly different role requirements for the different stakeholders and slightly different methodologies, but both very useful documents. So if you live in Hertfordshire, I found the Hertfordshire Climate Change and Sustainability Partnership have a guide to retrofitting your house, and it looks at a number of different house typologies, and it's actually a really good guide. And what is what I really like about it is it shows you a breakdown depending on the level of intervention that you want to take. So you can have a better understanding of the typical impact of a shallow retrofit, which might just include a few low-cost basic improvements, versus a deeper retrofit where you are having a more invasive fabric improvements, introducing mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, air source heat pump and renewable energies. And it gives you an indication of budgets and an indication of the energy savings you might expect, and you can make a kind of a more realistic decision around what it is that you can aim for in the short and the long term. I have to drop in the Low Energy Transformation Initiative, also known as LETI. If you aren't familiar with the guides that they have produced, please Google them because they are really, really brilliant. And they have this climate emergency retrofit guide. And so this is focused specifically on residential retrofit. And what they do really well is set clear targets for energy use, U values, air tightness. And so it's a really practical outcomes-based approach. And they split the different targets into best practice categories. So, and they have within that category both unconstrained and constrained targets. So the latter being where there are spatial constraints or planning and heritage constraints. And then they have an exemplar category, which is based on the ENEFIT standard. So ENEFIT is the retrofit version of Passive House, which is a quality assurance standard that is aimed at specifically at the design and delivery of low energy buildings. It's becoming much more common as an approach to new builds, and ENEFIT is becoming more common within the retrofit space as well. The general approach advocated by the Passive House Institute is if you do it right, basically. And even in existing buildings with the approach advocated by Passive House Institute, you can see significant heating and cooling energy savings of between 75 and 90%, which is very impressive. And the approach looks at improving thermal performance quite significantly. So looking at insulating walls, roofs and floors, reducing thermal bridges, considerably improving air tightness, using high quality windows, often needing triple glazing, introducing ventilation with heat recovery, having an efficient heat generation strategy, usually air source heat pump or something similar, and then the use of renewable energy sources as well. It is exemplar for a reason. It is a challenge. It, particularly with ENEFIT, it is often most appropriate as part of a whole building refurbishment project in an unconstrained site. So I've yet to see it done on a large scale. Someone might tell me I'm wrong, on a large scale listed building, but because it is challenging, the targets that are set. Though you can achieve the same results in stages, it isn't easy. So it's often kind of done in one go. And ENEFIT is an amazing goal, and the process and methodology it uses is incredibly thorough. And I would advocate for people to seriously consider it as a benchmark for any retrofit project. But at the same time, I believe we shouldn't let perfection get in the way of progress. So if we can't achieve the best, we can use the principles and the methodologies, but if the constraints of cost, site, time make that too difficult to achieve, we should still try and do something. We shouldn't be put off just because we can't get a certificate. So the most important part of any retrofit, whatever measure you decide to take forward or not, is to remember the building is a system of interconnected users, services and materials. So altering one part of the system will have an impact on other parts of the system. So for example, if you change your window and there's less light getting in through your window, you might need to turn your electric lights on more, which will have an impact on your energy use. Which will also have an impact on comfort or how you use the space. And so it's all of these different components are connected, and understanding that just as a principle is the most important first step. So as part of our Heritage Building Retrofit Toolkit for the City of London, we developed a process to try and navigate the complexity of retrofit, specifically in heritage settings, but there is absolutely no difference in approach really for any retrofit project, because this is based on the documents that I mentioned before, the past 2035 and 2038 processes. So I'm going to talk through these 9 steps in a bit more detail and throw in some case study examples as well. And I think it's worth pointing out again, because Purcell are heritage architects, that the case studies that I'm showing are for listed buildings, which may not be relevant to a lot of problems that you are all trying to solve. But at the same time, I kind of think if you can achieve some of these results in the most constrained and significant sites, then there's no real excuse to not be able to do it in unconstrained sites. So we're going to start with step 1, which is start from a position of knowledge. And for me, this is the most important step, because understanding the existing building is completely crucial to developing an appropriate retrofit response. You have to gather all the available data to understand the building's context, its surroundings, its situation, the history of the building, whether it is significant, its construction, what it was made of, the materials that it was used, how it's been adapted and changed over time, the condition of the building. So has it got damp problems? Is there water ingress? Is there mold? How much energy is it using? And what is the impact of that? Where's that energy coming from? How the building's being used, what is it used for, and what are the patterns of use, and also thinking about its current future climatic context. So is it likely at a high risk of flooding, for example? And then also from a project perspective, understanding the financial context of the owners and occupiers of the building, and how they maintain and look after their building. So looking at planned maintenance regimes and any of potential capital works projects that are coming up. If you're looking at a domestic project, is the resident thinking of changing their kitchen at some point in the near future, and can that be kind of wrapped up in a energy efficiency project as well? Energy use is really significantly impacted by occupant behaviour, particularly in existing buildings. So understanding the patterns of use, types of occupants, and their current and future requirements should feed into any baseline analysis. The more information gathered at the outset of the project and the more expertise during the early stages, the more informed the strategy, the greater an understanding of the impact of the decisions, and the lesser the risk. And the more studies you can do around heat loss, particularly with technologies like the thermal imaging cameras, the in situ U value calculations, things like that, to get a better understanding of how the existing fabric's performing, the lesser the risk, and the more easier it is to find solutions as you go down the line. And if you have multiple buildings or a large estate, this stage is also really useful for helping prioritise areas. So you might identify that there are particular buildings that are in a significantly poorer condition than others. There might be one building where the boiler is coming to the end of its life soon, and you'll need to kind of consider a replacement strategy for that. Are there large-scale capital works projects in the pipeline that will affect particular buildings? And so this stage is all really about kind of informing how you make decisions later on, particularly around phasing and technical details. So next up, we've got risks, and it's up front for a reason, because there are many risks when embarking on a building project, but actually working with existing buildings involves greater uncertainty, often associated with unknown factors like building condition, concealed defects, complex forms of construction, and specialist building techniques. These things can have consequences when you're trying to develop robust cost plans. There are risks associated with gaining planning and listed building consent, particularly when you're trying to make changes to heritage buildings. And this can obviously impact timeframes and budgets. So thinking about risks early on is really important. And it's also important to kind of think about the potential risks of the adaptations you might be about to make. So with the insertion of fabric efficiency measures and renewable energy sources, they might have unintended consequences if they're not considered and planned properly. So being aware of that is really important. So for example, putting on external wall insulation that isn't appropriate vapor permeability might harm the building fabric and trap moisture and cause issues to human health, where there is moisture accumulation or lack of adequate natural ventilation. not fully understanding the thermal performance of the existing fabric might mean that your predicted savings of energy savings and reductions are lower than what you'd anticipated. So that will have a lesser environmental impact than you'd hoped. And swapping out fuel source without fully considering what you're changing to or what the impact of it is could increase the risk of fuel poverty as well. So they're just a few. So one of the things that is quite important to identifying the risks is understanding how your building is designed to behave in terms of moisture and air movement, because when one of the bigger issues with retrofit, particularly with recent studies that came out early this year, are around the kind of the wrongly specified materials in particular situations. So the age of a building can have a significant impact on this. In the UK, historic and traditionally constructed buildings, we kind of refer to anything that was built pre-1919 as a traditionally constructed building, and they behave very differently to modern buildings. Modern buildings depend on impermeable barriers to control the movement and moisture of air through the building fabric. So things like vapor control layers, the impermeable cement and renders and things. In contrast, traditional forms of building construction, often solid wall construction, take up moisture from their surroundings and release it according to the environmental conditions. They also tend to have a greater thermal mass than their modern counterparts, meaning that they can heat up and cool down more slowly. And this ability to passively regulate moisture and heat helps to even out fluctuations in humidity and temperature. So the interrelationship between heat and moisture in traditional buildings is complex. In a well-maintained building that is adequately heated and ventilated, the daily and seasonal cycles of wet, dry, hot, and cold balance out naturally. But if you alter the building fabric to prevent this from happening and prevent this movement of air and moisture by, for example, the application of impermeable materials and excessively sealing the building up without thinking about ventilation, this can lead to problems of moisture accumulation, overheating, fabric damage, and poor indoor environmental conditions. So understanding the basic principles of building physics that you're dealing with and how the existing state of it is really crucial to reducing risks. And then adopting a risk-based approach to both carbon reduction and climate resilience will facilitate proper planning and consideration. So, for example, knowing that insulating and sealing up a traditional building reduces natural air movement ensures you then have a properly planned approach to ventilation. And then obviously we've also got the increasing frequency and severity of many physical climate hazards which are impacting our built environment, so including extreme flood events, increased rainwater, warmer temperatures, and severe drought leading to heave and swell risks. It's also introducing new hazards that could impact buildings, such as the spread of new and invasive pest species. It's really important that we take a proactive approach to this, even though it might feel kind of like an extra stress and scary thing to think about. But understanding and managing both individual and overall risk events, setting out clear strategies that either eliminate or reduce the threat or work to mitigate the consequences is really important. You can do that through a really simple climate hazard risk assessment or just project hazard risk assessment, but I would really advocate considering climate hazards as part of any of your normal risk assessment. Regardless of complexity, all retrofit projects should consider the potential impact of hazards created by climate change, particularly things like overheating if you're insulating. And you really want to kind of consider that you're not exacerbating, making a kind of existing condition worse. Okay, I'm just going to take a sip of water. So the third step is to identify the opportunities to reduce carbon emissions and build climate resilience. So this is this should hopefully follow a whole building approach, and that's where the consequences of every retrofit measure is fully understood and the building is considered as a system, like I mentioned earlier. So the whole building approach uses an understanding of a building in its context. It finds balanced solutions that save energy, promote occupant health and comfort, and sustain the significance, if there is heritage significance, or the kind of the public benefits. It considers the building as a system of interconnected materials, and interventions are designed to work together to deliver the maximum benefits as effectively as possible. So we use this hierarchy because it's quite useful to kind of work through a process of how you identify energy saving opportunities. And we try and work on the assumption that the greenest and cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. There is no one size fits all solution to making energy and carbon reductions in buildings. Every building, even if it looks the same from the outside, will have been adapted and changed at some point in its history. But priority should always be given to measures that eliminate unnecessary energy wastage. So often through behavioural change, good building maintenance. If you have damp wall in your building, you're going to lose heat 30% quicker than if it was dry. So making sure that your building is in good condition, your gutters are clear, you don't have damp or kind of water ingress is really important. Having efficient controls and equipment and making sure that they're working properly, and just really simple things like turning the thermostat down a degree can save a significant amount of money as well. So there's some easy wins there that should be considered before you go too far. And then implementing low-hanging fruit measures that mitigate the impact of unavoidable energy use. And I often think of these as the sort of low cost and easy to install measures with limited impact on the operation of the building. So things like energy efficient lighting is a really easy one, basic heating controls and better control settings. And then looking to improve the building fabric by means of insulation, air tightness measures, and by minimizing thermal bridging is likely to reduce heat loss and heat demand even further, and then reduce the required capacity of the heating system. But those measures are obviously more intrusive and need to consider the movement of the air and moisture, as we talked about before. And then that final strand, the active systems, by that we mean mechanical and electrical solutions that are low or zero carbon and renewable. And they are obviously a vital part of achieving net zero carbon emissions. But if you jump to these measures without first at least working through the other steps to seek to reduce energy demand, you could end up with a new energy source that will need to be larger and work harder and ultimately cost more to install and to run. So I like to start from the top down, working through components. So roof first, because heat rises and water and rain falls, so it makes it a logical place to start. So roof, walls, windows, floors, etc. Make a list of all the possible opportunities associated with each of those components, and then put everything on the table at the start and work logically through the pros and cons of each. It also helps then to create an itemized cost plan in this way as well, and you can see how that they link to each other, and deliberately look for the interdependencies. So for example, does upgrading a window need to also consider the potential future application of external or internal wall insulation in its detailing, as an example? So there may be multiple options for each component, each with different benefits and constraints, which will be dependent on the specifics of the building location, the specifics of the users, the appetite of the building users to live with disruption, and then weigh up the options objectively to find outcomes that are right for the building. So the key areas to consider are the thermal envelope, so insulation and glazing, looking for continuous thermal line, avoiding thermal bridges, considering trapped moisture, interstitial condensation and overheating, and then air tightness and ventilation, looking to eliminate drafts and air infiltration, lighting, but also other electrical and powered items, but again, looking for efficiencies there. And then heating and hot water, replacing fossil fuels is essential to getting to net zero. So how we do that in a phased and sensible way. And then renewables and opportunities to put photovoltaics, solar thermal, other opportunities. And then coming back to climate resilience. So to secure the long-term resilience of all our buildings, it is important to take steps to prepare them for climate change. And what we found is that many adaptation measures have the potential to reduce the risks associated with more than one climate hazard, and that's what this diagram is trying to explain. So for example, keeping the building in a good state of repair and increasing inspections and regular maintenance will reduce the risk of damage caused by water ingress from flooding and extreme weather events. Maintenance is really, really important. So rainwater goods will be kept clear and leaks and other defects will be caught early. So what that means is that this measure will also reduce the reliance on global supply chains by prolonging the lifespan of the building's fabric, and reducing the demand of materials and pressure on resources, infrastructure, and biodiversity. So there are lots of interlinking solutions. So once you've worked through all the opportunities and selected what is right for the building for the long term, they can be pulled together into a whole building retrofit plan. So a retrofit plan is a master plan for all the individual pieces of work needed to improve the building and how these interrelate. This means that when one piece of work is carried out, it considers the impact on future phases. The retrofit plan might change over time, but gives a snapshot of the intentions and helps think through the consequences of all the different phases. So it should include things like the building information, constraints, risks and opportunities, all the information that we did in step 1, and then the kind of carbon reduction, climate resilient pathway, setting clear targets and actionable measures, the phasing and the sequencing of the work, what requirements are for statutory approvals and consents, what the whole building retrofit strategy is. And where you are on that state along that plan. It's often a evolving document which can change over time. And then how you plan for monitoring and reporting energy consumption in occupation. So a retrofit plan doesn't need to be carried out all in one go. It can be phased, but should consider the consequences of each phase on subsequent phases. So this is quite different to a conventional approach to refurbishment, which is to change each element individually without considering the building as a whole. Carrying out a single piece of maintenance or improvement works as an opportunity arises is not a problem in itself, but it needs to be part of the phased and planned retrofit approach, because dealing with different parts of the building piecemeal, even if upgrading the individual element, it can result in negligible energy and carbon savings and potentially damage to the building. So a whole building approach can deliver the most benefits and avoid unintended consequences. And a good example of this is if you think about a roof. If you need to upgrade a roof because you are aware that it's coming to the end of its life, is that a perfect opportunity to properly insulate it and ensure it is possible to easily install solar panels, even if the solar panels aren't going to be installed immediately because they're not part of the budget? It would be a missed opportunity if it wasn't properly planned, and when solar panels were considered later on, it wasn't possible because it hadn't been designed into the roof redesign. So plan for future changes and understand what comes next so abortive work is eliminated. So the 5th step we've kind of already talked about a little bit, is about building a business case. And so we've talked about the benefits of taking retrofitting buildings that go beyond carbon emissions, that to creating healthy, comfortable indoor environments, energy security, reducing risk, and increasing market value and avoiding stranded assets. And clearly identifying these benefits and understanding any external funding opportunities particularly will help build a stronger business case for the work. And it's important that the business case aims to cover the whole life cost of a building, so including energy and maintenance savings and increased asset value that comes with the work. So the cost of alternatives should also be included, and the value of non-financial benefits should be considered, so those health benefits, for example. And by modelling the savings identified in energy performance over time against the cost of the investment, that can also help with the business case for a retrofit. So I've got, I did promise a couple of case studies. So this is the grade 2 listed Camden Town Hall, and I've snuck it in within the business case piece of the presentation because the business case for the refurbishment and retrofit of this building was based on the diversification of the building's core uses. So the civic uses for the town hall, which are very important and still a community asset, as part of this refurbishment, were combined with a variety of commercially lettable spaces, and that helped the viability and made the building a financially self-sufficient hub for a wide range of different activities, both day and night, maximizing its value to the wider community whilst minimizing its environmental impact through some sensitive retrofit of the building envelope, which was able to be scooped up in the scope of the diversification of the building uses. So the upgrades included the building upgrades to the building fabric, so some additional insulation, bespoke secondary glazing and full services replacement, and the installation of 3 state-of-the-art, I didn't write that, but air source heat pumps to eliminate fossil fuel use, which are on the roof in the bottom right-hand corner. See them in that, because it's probably too small, but by putting them on the roof, because it's a central London site, there's a limited amount of space, but the thing to probably be aware of here is that adds weight to an existing roof, and a 1930s roof was not designed to take the weight of 3 air source heat pumps, and so it required quite careful threading of steel structure down through the listed fabric to achieve the results. But the next project is even more significant. It's a grade 1 listed building, the Newcastle Cathedral. And what I really like about this project, and again why it's useful from building a business case point of view. So the problem with this cathedral was that there was a lot of ancient stone ledges. So those, you can see them in this picture on the left. Stones that you normally see in the centre of the nave of the church, of the cathedral, had got so wobbly over time. Basically, it was a nightmare from an accessibility point of view. And so that project, there was a project that needed to take these stone ledges up and move them to the side of the church where they weren't going to get as damaged, and then you could provide universal access. And what started as a universal access project then took the opportunity to, because you were taking up an ancient floor anyway, put down some insulation and underfloor heating, and then connect that underfloor heating to an air source heat pump, which is part of a wider zoning strategy whereby other zones within the cathedral can also be provided with an air source heat pump as and when funding becomes available and the existing gas boilers reach the end of their life. So it's about taking the opportunities as and when they present themselves, and making sure you plan for the future and how other things might get adapted and facilitated at a later date. So step 6 is about detailed design and specification. And again, I don't want to reiterate the same things, but it's taking into account those issues around the materials that we're specifying, how our building's performing, particularly with the things like vapor permeability and moisture movement, air tightness, adequate ventilation, thermal performance. But the other thing also to kind of think about is the whole life carbon impact of the materials that we're using. And this is 2 really useful resources. So the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance have got this responsible retrofit guidance wheel, and it's in some ways it's quite overwhelming, because you click on one of the measures and it kind of immediately spans out to all of the other measures that are relevant to that particular intervention. But it is very good at getting a handle on what the interconnectedness of all of these different retrofit measures. And then on the right hand side, that's an extract from the past 2035 document, which again is doing the same kind of thing. It's thinking about the interconnectedness of different energy efficiency measures. And I just touched on it, but it is important to consider the whole life carbon emissions of any proposed measures, and the embodied carbon of retrofit projects can be significant, and if it's not properly considered, could outweigh the long-term operational carbon savings. So measures that improve the thermal performance of a building, like adding insulation, have a potential to increase the embodied carbon. Therefore, whole life carbon should be a key factor in any decision making. You can minimize embodied carbon emissions in a retrofit project by eliminating new materials where they're not needed, reusing existing materials as much as possible, specifying durable, long-lasting, low embodied carbon materials, often bio-based materials, and avoiding over-specification of services. And So step 7 is just about seeking relevant approvals, and it's just a note to probably you're all very well informed about the requirement, particularly if you're in a conservation area or if your building is listed, retrofit measures will need some form of consent. So it's best to consult with an expert or the local authority and confirm approval requirements in terms of planning. The other thing to be really cognizant of is building regulations and the overlapping of building energy efficiency measures, particularly when it comes to things like fire, and party wall awards as well, which often energy efficiency measures can impact. And so I've got this slide in because this is an interesting project up in Yorkshire. So this is Ledston Hall, which is a Grade 1 listed. It was a stately home. It's been converted into flats, and this was the first residential Grade 1 building that got consent for double glazing on a listed building, on a Grade 1 listed building. And these are slimline double glazing units, and the way we were allowed to integrate these into the proposals was through a really thorough and engaging process that with the local conservation officer and Historic England. And so it's best to engage it, particularly if the interventions are very sensitive. It's best to engage people as early as possible and show what is possible from other case studies where they're available. And I suppose on the installation, site operations can have a really significant impact on the effectiveness of a retrofit project. So find a contractor who's familiar with your building type and the construction methodology that you're hoping to use, and who shows an interest in what you're trying to achieve, because it's really important that the kind of on-site quality assurance is maintained, because that can kind of really make or break a retrofit project. And to reiterate, it is really, really important to make sure that you've dealt with any defects before starting a retrofit project. There is no point adding insulation to a wall that's got damp, because it won't get any better, and it will mean that your wall is very inefficient, and it's a complete waste of time. And this is my final case study. I appreciate that we're kind of coming up, this is on time. So this is St John's College in Cambridge, and again it's Grade 1 listed building, but primarily to demonstrate to you what can be achieved in the most sensitive settings. And so here we took the opportunity, which was part of a capital works project, to take out an old concrete floor, which was not original, put in a new foam glass insulated limecrete floor. We put wood, and next slide is wood wool insulation on the walls, and installed a heat pump, underfloor heating, and there's vents that run down the side of, you can't see on this particular slide, but there's ventilation tracks that run down the sides, and window upgrades, and we were able to achieve a 39% reduction in peak heat demand in this Grade 1 listed building, which is very positive for the college. There's the windows. We sadly weren't able to put in double glazing because the conservation area officer didn't approve it, but these we were able to reuse the existing frames, which is good. And then finally, the last step, the ongoing monitoring and long-term oversight of the delivered outcomes will be key to understanding the impacts of any retrofit projects. Basically, just learning from the lessons of a project, feeding back into the position of knowledge for the next project. So testing the completed building against the original brief, talking to the users, ensuring the correct operation, and feeding back lessons for future projects is really, really important. And then this is my final slide, because it's a quote from the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, and I think it's very relevant to what we're all trying to achieve today, which is, in our own actions, we consider the legacy we leave to future generations. And that is me. Thank you very much. Oh, I do have all of these links. These are the links to all the documents that I've mentioned. So I think Deepthi was going to drop them in the chat, and if I stop sharing, I might be able to see some faces or some chats. Yes, thank you.
Laura, we have a question in the chat.
Mhm.
Adit Kiran. Could you read the chat?
Yes, I can see it now. So how to employ a whole life approach when the resident is a rented tenant and the owner liaises through a property manager and the building is a different person who has no connection to an owner, and the user tenant can only report issues one at a time and a whole building approach is harder to implement. It's a really good question, and not one I think I'm going to be able to answer. Tenure is a real challenge when it comes to retrofitting residential buildings. And I think what is encouraging is that and others on the call might have a view on this. I think it would be really interesting to open it up, because I'm quite encouraged by the shift in the market, particularly around like people's expectations of what they want how they want their homes to perform. I think there was quite a realization during the energy price hike about when Russia invaded Ukraine around the cost of energy, and I think there is real awareness, and so I think hopefully there can be pressure from tenants can make building owners take action with any luck. I appreciate it's not easy. I think there needs to be a bit of a top down and bottom up approach with these things, and I think yeah, it requires both government initiative to force landlords to make the necessary changes, but also pressure from residents to make it clear that that is what they're expecting and that they're informed enough to know what needs to happen. But yes, but I think it is possible to do a whole building approach doesn't necessarily mean that everything needs to be done in one go. And I think that's the thing that I try and get across is a whole building approach just means that you need to think joined up about the sequence of things. And if you're doing something, is it prohibiting you doing something later on, or is it does it need to be designed and specified in a particular way so that it's not a waste later on? I don't know if that answers the question, Adith, but it was a challenging question.
We have another question from Nick Rayleigh.
Do you have any thoughts on anything more that can be done from a design perspective to make it easier to address the sector retrofit and indeed overall skills shortage? Skills is an interesting one. So I think, well, from my perspective, I work with, I can only talk about what I know. So I am an architect and I work with a lot of architects, and I do see that there is a pressure on architects and generally for consultants in the construction sector to know everything about everything. And so I think what I try and do to help people is identify who within an organization can hold the particular knowledge and know that they, you know, whether there's a few people that are really skilled up on passive houses, a few people that are really skilled up on the heritage retrofit stuff, and it's just sharing that load a little bit. So not everybody needs to be an expert in everything, because I think there is a lot, but I do think that taking some ownership of being informed ourselves. I think the other thing that I say with retrofit is that it's not a new thing. It's not groundbreaking technology. You just need to be aware of what the risks are to be able to make informed decisions. And I think I think the solutions have been around for quite a long time. We did a really interesting building which completed in 2012 called the Centre for Refurbishment Excellence, and it was born out of the funding from the kind of the green crap funding that David Cameron scrapped in 2013. So the actual use that it was designed for, the Centre for Refurbishment Excellence, it never actually got used for that purpose, but the building was built to demonstrate all of these different technologies and all of these different approaches to retrofit. And it had, you know, heat pumps, it had biomass boilers and solar panels, and that was the first slide that I had was the picture of the solar panels on the roof. And so these technologies, the approach and the technologies haven't really changed much. It's just the urgency has changed, and there is definitely a skills shortage, and I think that does need to be addressed. But I think we can all be better informed and all just learn from the stuff that we see around us, and not necessarily be put off by thinking that we need new innovation to solve all of the problems, because they're kind of problems that have been around for a while.
Laura, the next question is from Purvesh Bharadwaj.
Industry outlook on whether working within system boundaries is the way ahead to solve such problems, or is there a case of exploring a solution outside the boundary and visualizing the holistic impact on wider society? I don't know, Pravesh, do you want to turn your camera on and explain the question? I'm not sure I understand it properly.
Sure. So my kind of, I'm just going through my phone here, so the camera's not quite working very well. My question really stems on from the concept of, you know, having to retrofit, which is, I know, in your case, we've explored different case studies where we're looking at individual buildings, then that does make sense. But I'm wondering whether what the industry's outlook is in terms of developing solutions in such a manner which actually incorporates a wider society to begin with, and not really focusing on a singular site level and addressing a singular problem at a singular place. Because it feels like the more we try to do it in that manner, the more we are, and of course, you know, no site is going to be the same. Every site's going to have its own challenges. Every community is going to have its own challenges. But, you know, in the latter case, where we're working with the community, it seems that when you kind of hand the reins over to co-pilot the entire project, you get much better results.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really valid point. I think you might already be familiar with it, but I'll redirect you to the work of Civic Square and Dark Matter Labs, and that 3 degree neighborhood piece of work is all about that, and all about community driven rethinking the systems that we're working within, and trying to change perceptions on what retrofit can be and who it's serving. And they do a retrofit reimagined. I don't know if you've heard of that. Yes. Yeah. So that's the questions that all of those are trying to address. I think it takes everything what I've concluded, because we've got lots of people that are already working, and it's important that the people that are working within the system to keep trying to make the system better from within, but it's also important that we have people out that are thinking outside of the system as well, and trying to make progressive changes and get people to think about things differently. It's really one of the things that we're trying to do at Architects Declare. We're looking at policy context and how we can influence the policy of the new Labour government, and into rethinking what they mean by providing 1.5 million new homes, and what the opportunities of that could be if they weren't just farmed out to the top 5 house builders in the UK, if they were thinking about how to make those homes regenerative in the way that they're constructed, in the way that they use materials, and in the way that they interact with communities. And so it takes all sorts at every level, is what I've concluded. You can't, no one person has got the answer, but everybody's got to keep kind of talking about it, and keep throwing ideas at those that have the power to kind of make some of the decisions and change things.
Yeah.
But it's a really, really good question, a really important point.
Yeah. I mean, this Luigi probably knows this. Is kind of stems from what we're teaching on the MR course at the university, we are trying to sort of expose our students to almost sort of, giving them a breakdown of an entirely different approach that they've been trained to, in terms of, this is a site, this is what you're going to be designing, this is how you need to address it. But then again, you've got to consider the community aspects of it. There are so many intangible elements, things like health and well-being, that are not really being tapped into, and not really being considered by a lot of people at the moment. And this is why I thought it would have been a nice question to just have a short discussion on, because the industry has kind of feels like some people are working on that, some people are not, and maybe we just need to coalesce and work in that direction.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what I also find is, though, I work with a lot of architects that are just trying to get by and want to do the right thing. And what I also try and find is ways for them to have conversations with clients that wouldn't otherwise care about efficiency measures and stuff. And what are the tools to give them to try and influence the projects that are live now and that they're working on now? And not everybody feels that particularly industry, feels that they have agency to push in some of the directions that you're kind of talking about. So I think it's really, really important that you're having those conversations in education. And I wish I had those kind of conversations when I was in education.
You're more than welcome to join.
Thank you.
We'd love to have you, because I shared similar experiences when I was in consultancy a few years ago, and it is sort of mind-boggling, because you have all of these agendas and targets, but it kind of inhibited by all of these different things to achieve them. But yeah,
definitely. And I think I've always found, like, in education, you are allowed that freedom to kind of think outside of what the constraints of you're dealing with, but equally there's people are currently trying to just run a business in what is quite a tumultuous period for the construction sector. And so it's kind of you're trying to balance both things and allow space for those sorts of big ideas, and how you can kind of push in those directions, but also give people the tools to actually just get by on a day-to-day and feel like they're having an impact. That's a good question.
Thank you, Purvesh. The next question is about air quality. It's by Matt Fisher.
Thinking exclusively about air quality, what pitfalls, oversights have been identified thus far with retrofit? So I guess, well, it's a kind of broad problem. So I think the things that jump out are where you have, and it comes mostly down to having damp and poor ventilation, and so that it causes the buildup of damp, and therefore you get mold on the walls, and therefore you've got poor indoor air quality, and that's the kind of biggest issue. But then I suppose you've also got, if you really dive into the world of health and well-being, you've got the indoor air quality from issues of the materials that we're specifying as well. And so the VOCs and the things related to all of the chemicals and crap that we pump into fireproofing and stuff like that. So it's quite a broad question. Matt, you've turned your camera on, which is a relief. Do you want to expand?
No, I guess it's just everything is all interconnected, as you've quite rightly just said then, and also through your presentation, which was excellent. I've just come from an cleaner air seminar for Herts County, and so that's the buzzword. And so it's really interesting as a polarized view to think about how we're looking to improve insulation, etc. But as you've said, these are all interconnected. So we've got pitfalls in terms of insulation, and you've got damp, as you've mentioned. Holistically, by way of the air quality, we spoke of, like, the obvious fix in terms of air quality might well be just to open the window. But of course, there is no such thing called indoor air and outdoor air. It's all the same thing, right? One can pollute the other. So I just wondered if there were any obvious low-lying fruit, scenarios that you could comment on. And I guess the damp is a quick win, and that's evident and obvious to see.
it is difficult as well, isn't it? If you're in an inner city location, opening the window isn't necessarily going to make your indoor air quality any better either, is it? So I think it isn't an area that I feel expert in at all. So there might be others on the call that feel much more expert. But I think my view would be that when we're specifying materials, that we just are aware of the impacts, both from the time that they're manufactured, they pulled out of the ground, who that's impacting, what communities that's coming from, and the transportation routes it takes. So you have both the global impacts of materials and the kind of in-use localized impacts of the materials. And I think just having that view, we did a really interesting workshop when as part of ACAN, so Architects Climate Action Network, where we're thinking about materials, but through donut, if you come across donut economics, through the donut. So if you take a material like timber or concrete or something and look at it through the donut economics of the environmental ceiling, so the carbon impacts and the impacts of that, but also the social impacts of it, but on a global and a local scale, and just really like be informed about it. And so before you and I talk about this to all of my colleagues, and I'm giving them more things to do in their day job, and they're already very busy. But there's just a benefit to being better informed about what we're doing as architects, as specifiers, as builders, and just knowing where things come from. Why I advocate so much for reuse as well, because the materials aren't coming that they already exist, you've already got them, you already know what kind of conditions they are, and usually if they were going to off gas something, then they've probably already done it in their lifetime, so they've come to a point where they're a bit more inert and stuff, so there's lower risk of them impacting negatively air quality that way. I think also the specification of natural materials generally, and not using not using really processed paints. And even when I paint my own house, if you can like feel the difference if you use a clay paint versus a kind of just Dulux off the shelf paint. And there's a reason, that there's just something better about kind of the naturalness of those materials. It's a really good question. I think I wish I was more informed on it, but I think just generally.
Yeah, I think it is just that. It's about being informed and looking at it holistically. And from my hat, which is a counsellor, so although I'm not overly proficient in all of this, you are the experts, you guys. And so, but I think it is that informing Joe Public as to when you change something proactively with good intention, it may well have another knock-on effect. It's all interlinked, right? And which you've quite eloquently put. So yeah, no, that's helpful. I won't take any more airtime. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ma. The next question is from Laura Morita, and is about replacement windows in listed buildings.
Oh, I always get a windows question. Particular issue we have on various projects in London, either in conservation area or the Grade 2 listed buildings, making it difficult to build in an effective thermal improvement strategy. So the thing that I always get a question on windows, because it's so tricky. Windows, I can say this because I'm not a heritage architect, and I don't come from a heritage background. I come at this role from a sustainability background, so I have differing views to colleagues and people that are more embedded in the conservation world. My view is that first of all, if you're not aware of the Historic England Advice Note that came out last year on energy efficiency measures, it kind of lists out lots of different measures on what is acceptable energy efficiency measures in particular historic settings, and it's all about them trying to be more amenable to changes within the built environment, within the historic environment. So I would start there as a starting point. I think it's HEAN 18 or something. I can drop the link in later. But that's a good place to start, because you can kind of throw that back in their face and say, look, you've said this, you've said that this might be acceptable. But I think that what you have to do when you're dealing with heritage is always balance the benefit versus the harm. And so the benefit historically, we've always managed to argue a benefit to society if the measure is something to do with like accessibility improvements or fire and life safety improvements. And so you measure there the benefit to society of putting in a ramp outside a Grade 1 listed building versus the harm that it's causing the aesthetics of that Grade 1 listed building. What the new Historic England Advice Note does is basically state that energy efficiency measures are considered a public benefit in historic buildings, even if it's in a private building. And so that came out last year, and to me that was quite groundbreaking, because it allows you to put, you can weigh up now windows versus the harm. It still doesn't necessarily make it an easy conversation, and I think the more you can go back to that the knowledge piece and say, well, we've done in situ testing on this, we know the thermal performance, we know we've modeled it from an energy perspective, we know that this is going to save X tons of carbon a year or over the lifetime of the building, and if we don't do it, then this is what's going to happen. And you can put really starkly in numbers and data what the benefit is of doing that measure versus the perceived harm to the historic fabric of the building. Does that help, Laura?
Yeah, no, it does, absolutely. It does frame it. I think oh, you probably couldn't hear me.
No, we
Can
could
you
hear you.
now?
We could hear you.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, that gives me a little bit of reference. I think we have used modeling in the discussion with the officer. We have found still quite a bit of resistance of immediate replacement. More of a discussion of, yes, we can build it in. Things might change in 5 or 10 years. And of course you could, yeah. And you can build that in to some extent, but then going back to what you were saying earlier about implementing changes when there's a good opportunity, and we're doing a lot of the work now, leaving that change later on will undo, a good part of what we're putting in now. So it's just such a shame that, some of that gap can be bridged now.
Yeah, it doesn't help that the kind of the system around the protection of heritage is so subjective, and I think what a lot of local authorities are now trying to do is be a bit clearer around what is and isn't allowed. And I don't what was the local authority that your particular
We were in Camden in particular.
Yeah, I know, like, so RBKC have got locally listed building consent orders in place now that clearly say if you've got a grade 2 listed building in RBKC, you can put solar panels on the roof if they follow these rules without listed building consent. And if you've got a grade 2 or 2-star, I think, listed building, you can put this kind of windows in this situation without listed building consent. And so they're being really, really clear about it. I've still heard tales around that they're still not necessarily quite they're still not really bedded in the local listed building consent orders. But I think, yeah, it is a challenge, and windows are honestly the question I get every time, and I don't have an answer, but all we can do is just keep sharing examples.
I think that's
bad.
I think that's it, right? Because I think we're all facing that issue, and it's the bit that we feel like things are not necessarily moving on. But no, thank you. I think that's been helpful.
I think the thing that I'm heartened by, so I've been doing this job for nearly 3 years, and the change in the language and the tone and the dialogue in the heritage sector in the last 3 years is like completely changed. So I'm heartened by that, and I think it will have changed again in the next 5 years, because people are seeing the urgency of what we're facing, and we're going to end up with a load of listed buildings that nobody wants to occupy because they can't get the performance that they need them to be. So we will see.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Laura, the next question is by Alessandro Boy about the government incentive to analyze buildings.
It's a really good question. I don't know of any. I'd love to say yes, but I don't know of any. Because this is one of the problems that you have, is that upfront cost of the analysis that is really important to helping inform the decision making is quite expensive if you're going to do it properly. And so trying to convince clients that is a really important thing to do. And the world of the grants and funding and things around retrofit is still imperfect in my view. So there is things like you can get grant funding for a heat pump if you're as a private resident. If your boiler is coming to the end of its life, I think you can get those public sector decarbonisation fund, there's social housing decarbonisation fund. But again, they've only in recent times included the whole building approach within the application process. So it's a kind of imperfect system at the moment, the funding of retrofit, and again, one that changes quite regularly. So I don't have a positive answer for that one.
The next question is at Yabana about the hierarchical concept. You can read yourself.
No question in there, but I'll take that. Thank you.
Okay. And then I think we have one last question by Asif Dean.
Hi, Asif. A large project, how do you preserve, particularly analyze? Hi, Asif. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Good. So is this a question about bringing stuff in-house?
It's a question about doing upfront analysis, which I think most architects firms do, but then being able to preserve it, because otherwise you lose that system thinking approach later on, because it gets farmed off to somebody else and they silo it and they come up with a specific answer and then they stick to it. So it's that sort of question.
And it is, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because there's the role of the architect and the role of the consultant team, like they're all just getting more specialized and like siloed is exactly the right word. And it's how do you pull that back together? And I am really keen. I mean, we don't do WFI. We've got one person that does WFI analysis in our office and a couple that do LCA analysis, and we're trying to like really build that so that we can have it as part of the design process. Again, it's not always something that clients are willing to pay for. It's not always something that you can kind of it's often something that they can pay for if it's a requirement for planning and things like that. I don't know, how do you guys get on with it?
You're going to tell that's what we do effectively. We do it up front and we do it as part of the design process, but we never say that we're going to be doing RICS version 2, for example, for LCA, because we'll never go into that level of depth, but we'll go into a level of depth just enough to actually influence design.
And inform.
And inform, but we won't do it for certification. We won't do it for sort of like the certification or stamping, shall we say.
And then if you've got, if you're a small practice and there's only 4 of you in the practice, how do you then kind of build up that capacity as well without needing lots of other?
Well, sort of like I have my view on it, and effectively, sort of like listening to the discussion is that systems analysis starts anywhere. So you can do stuff quite lightly, but sort of like as long as you're touching all of the bases, then you're going to come out with a Pareto type solution. You're going to get 60 to 80% of the way there. But it's sort of like the real in-depth sort of like systems thinking means that there's more and more time for actually less and less output, but you do still get that, a tangible result. So it's trying to find that right point. And for a small firm, I think you can get 50% of the way there reasonably easily, but you have to think about it in terms of that system.
Yeah, I always tell our architects that architects are kind of naturally systems thinkers anyway, because as soon as because of the way we have to design and work as a team, if a column needs to be moved by the structural engineer, it's going to impact the room layout, it's going to impact the finishes, it's going to impact the service runs, and you're already thinking like that. So it's just an expansion of that thought process and the skills that they've kind of already got established from just leading a design team.
Yeah, I think quite a lot of architects don't have the vocab on certain aspects or don't think about, the good example is effectively the column moving and thinking of what detailing is and other things, but then also thinking about how that influences internal layout, how that influences carbon, for example. It's something that you can learn over time and you can get a gut feel for. I can look at, I'm sure you can look at a plan and basically say, oh no, that's going to be, a fair amount of carbon you're going to be spending in that to make sure that works. But it's actually just almost getting them to ask those research questions in some sort of ways. Who, what, why, where, when, what's going to happen? and expand that to the max.
Yeah, and it's and adding just an extra layer of thinking onto what they're already doing. It's not kind of,
Yes.
yeah. I think I try not to terrify our architects by giving them loads of extra things to do. It's like it's more just it's an expansion of what you're already doing. It's not like a new thing that you need to learn and do. Thank you for that input, because I think you answered your own question, but it was very
All
useful
right.
for me.
No. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Atif. If there's no other question, I think Asif's question was the last one. Dipsy?
Thank you so much, Laura.
You're welcome. That was a very engaged group.
I think I'm gonna share my screen again and ask you all to take your phones out and scan the QR code again for the last question. Do you see my screen? Please scan the QR code and please answer the question so that we know what you learned from this session and if it met your expectations and everything else. Mhm. The emphasis on the importance of zero carbon retrofit, whole building approach, improved awareness. I think there's a lot on knowledge and awareness coming out. And I agree that when we need awareness before we start anything. And I guess, Laura, you did a great job at it. Any last comments from your end?
If I can jump on this, it was a very informative session, Laura. I think your presentation communicate quite clearly to the audience, putting them in front of a very complex landscape. Is very interrelated. It's very complex, but it's good that people start to engage at all levels. I think in the audience we have people from different parts of the world, not just from the UK, different level of expertise in thermal architecture, people outside the sector, people very into the sector. And I feel even this question and answer at the end, it was very informative, because it's always nice when we start discussing, and sometimes we don't have answer, sometimes we take on board other point of view. And because of the course, which is made of 6 different events, I think some of these answers could be, some of these questions could be answered in the next few events. And then maybe at the very end of the 6th event, there will be even more questions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it, because I think that there will be different the different topics will input into the kind of the same sort of conversations, won't it?
Please join us and please helping us to make an impact in the world. Every action count, even a small one, even a day action count to reduce low carbon, save our planet, and reach the net zero target as a community. Because we don't need to wait for people to take action. We don't need to wait for the architect to take action, to the council to take action. We need to take action as a group. And this Greener Together has been designed with this in mind. We are a community, and as a community, we can contribute to improving the world we're living. Thank you, everyone. Stop sharing now. Thank you, Laura. It was precious, your presentation. And I'm looking forward for next week.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.